everybody. When Linda asked me to introduce Richard tonight, I think it was partly because we're very old friends. We studied together at SOAS and at the University of Cambridge. But it's also because I think that Richard and I have really maintained a very keen interest in each other's work throughout our careers. We're both these strange animals in that we're historical ethnomusicologists. And we are also both very interested in music analysis, neither of which is particularly fashionable within ethnomusicology, particularly in the United States. I think that one of the things that Richard and I tossed around quite a lot, and I think was a common point of interest for us both, over the last few years, was the way in which musical acts enact much larger, I'm trying to avoid the word schemas, but much larger dimensions of beings, ontologies and cosmologies and local political events and those sorts of things. And we were both really interested in tying those things up. But Richard's really now taken another step, which is to really look at those musical events and things like cosmologies and religious beliefs and political dimensions and all those things as being things that emanate from something that is underlying them all. I hope this is right. And so his work's very much informed by work that's been done in cognitive musicology and cognitive anthropology. And if I were still active as a researcher, this is definitely the track that I would be going down myself, but it gives me, a lot of pleasure to just to see Richard's work unfolding. As Linda said, he's Professor of Musicology at the University of London. He's well known as an authority on South Asian music, and he's one of the leaders in musicological thinking in the world today. He's written 3 very important books, the latest one of which, about devotional singing in Nepal, is very much informed by the theoretical directions that I just outlined, and I've been really enjoying reading my copy of it, Richard. One last thing before I hand over, because I've been said that I mustn't take up all your time. Richard established the music department at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. And it has grown to be one of the most dynamic and interesting music departments anywhere in the world. It has recently distinguished itself by leading all the music departments in terms of publications in the British RAF. And it has a really very vital performing culture as well, as a very strong scholarly profile. I'm sure that Richard wouldn't want me to credit him with everything that's happened at SOAS, and I think probably if I did, we'd both be in trouble. Mm-hmm. But it's certainly the case that it has been very much guided by his vision. So he is a visionary both in terms of musicological pedagogy, and also in terms of research. So it's my very great pleasure, Richard, to invite you to give you a talk which is so succinctly called Cognitive Research and South Asian Music.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan, for that very generous introduction, and thank you to Linda and to the Sydney Conservatorium of Music for this invitation to give this very prestigious lecture. Every evening at about 8 o'clock, a group of men assemble at the temple of Dapha in the town of Bhaktapur, Nepal, to sing sacred hymns to gods and goddesses. They are farmers who live in the nearby streets of the town and go out to work in their fields by day. It is for them both a duty and a pleasure to sing for 2 hours every evening throughout the year without exception, accompanying themselves on cymbals, drum and natural trumpet. They sing a minimum of 5 or 7 songs, and by singing every line repeatedly, each song is extended to many times its original length. Preliminary and concluding rituals and breaks for conversation between songs mark the event as both a sacred and a social interaction. This style of sacred singing is called Dapha. If we wish to understand what's happening in Dapha performance, we might approach it as a form of social behavior, a tradition maintained by the local community in the interests of social cohesion and identity. Or we might look at it historically, linking it with earlier palace culture and present ethnic identity politics. We might examine the song texts, which express humble devotion to various deities, or record mythological or historical events in the name of former royal patrons. Or we might analyse the structure of the music, by which I mean the musical conventions that unify the repertoire and the style, and the systematic organisation of musical events successively in the performance of each song. We might choose to focus on the roles of singers and instrumentalists and their interactions in performance, or on the integration of music and ritual with the annual cycle of religious festivals and agricultural seasons. All these approaches help us to understand the many levels of meaning embedded in the musical genre Dapha. But even in combination, they are perhaps an incomplete answer to the question, why do the singers perform this music? Why do they enjoy performing it? What kind of experience does it provide for them, and what for us? And what is the role of musical structure in engendering that experience? Later in this talk, I'll come back to Dapha and suggest some possible answers to these questions. First, I want to introduce the notion that analysing the structure of this or any other music is not an arid formalistic exercise insulated from the dynamics of daily life, but takes us to the heart of human cognitive experience, and thereby links music with other realms of cultural meaning, such as social, historical, or religious significance. I'll argue that cognitive capacities exercised by humans cross-culturally underlie the culture-specific meanings and experiences of music. I'll argue that processes of implicit learning enable musical structure to be learned, that recursive structure in music exploits the universal capacity for recursive thought, but may acquire context-specific meanings, and that performance practices may conform to culture-specific cognitive models and at the same time be designed to generate the cross-culturally attested psychological state of flow. While the meanings of music may be unique to a particular society, there is good reason to believe that the cognitive abilities involved in music are shared cross-culturally, even universally. For example, the capacity to entrain to a rhythmic pulse, or to learn melodic, rhythmic, formal and stylistic schemas. Indeed, such capacities are not unique to music, but also play their part in other domains of human behavior and experience, such as physical action, visual perception, and language. We know from experience that unfamiliar music can make sense to us, can appear meaningful rather than random, though we may be unsure what its meaning is. Repeated experience of the unfamiliar can teach us its structures, especially if its structures resemble something more familiar. Conscious awareness of this process is no more necessary than it is for children learning their native language. The ability to decode musical structure, to make implicit sense of music, presumably underlies the global spread of genres such as Bollywood film music, Indian classical music, and Western popular and classical music, to say nothing of cross-cultural transmissions at earlier periods of history. In Nepal, Dapha itself is the result of such a transmission of the Prabandha tradition of medieval Indian court and religious song. The relevance of cognitive research to ethnomusicology and of ethnomusicology to cognitive research is increasingly accepted in both disciplines. Scholars including Judith Becker, Francesca Sborgi-Lawson, Martin Clayton and Ian Cross have already transcended this disciplinary boundary in their recent work. But cross-disciplinary research is perhaps most easily done through collaboration. And I've had the immense privilege of collaborating with a colleague who works on the cognitive side of the divide, Martin Rohrmeyer. Martin's career has taken him within the last decade from the Centre of Music and Science at Cambridge University to the Max Planck Institute in Berlin, the Linguistics Department at MIT, and currently the Technical University Dresden, and that is Martin. We have also involved in our research as a collaborator the very distinguished sitarist Dharambir Singh, who is a well-established performer in the UK and originally a disciple of the late Vilayat Khan. Such a cross-disciplinary perspective, I will suggest, is relevant to the study of music in particular cultural environments, such as South Asia, to cross-cultural perspectives on the meanings of musical structure, and ultimately to the study of the cognitive capacities underlying all human music making. In the words of ethnomusicologist John Blacking, the whole point of understanding music as music is that we carry in our bodies the cognitive equipment to transcend cultural boundaries and resonate at the common level of humanity. Implicit learning is the process by which we acquire knowledge or skills unintentionally and unknowingly. We do this all the time, whether learning to ride a bicycle, speak our native language, or recognize a particular composer's music. Sometimes we have some awareness of our knowledge without being able to say how we know it. For example, we may feel sure that a particular English sentence is grammatically incorrect without being able to explain why it is incorrect. This is called judgment knowledge. Implicit knowledge remains inaccessible to conscious reflection. Implicit learning has been empirically demonstrated in the context of Western music by Martin Rohrmeyer and others. Martin and I decided to examine whether it could also be demonstrated in the case of Indian classical music, using volunteers from a Western cultural background who had no previous familiarity with Indian music. We hypothesized that through implicit learning, our subjects might be able to distinguish between two ragas on the basis of their different melodic grammars. In Indian classical music, a raga is a set of melodic conventions within a given scale that generate composed and improvised melodies. We looked for two ragas that have the same basic scale but clearly differ in melodic conventions. And we chose the ragas Tori and Multani because the scale they share is distinctively different from the scales of Western music and would thus be unfamiliar to our subjects. As always in Indian classical music, the scalar pitches are heard against the background of a repeated pitch reference or drone defining the tonal center. This slide shows how the scale of these two ragas is differently weighted in terms of strong and weak pitches. So in Tori, the strong pitches, apart from the tonic, are 3 and 6. In Multani, they are 1 and 5, whereas in Multani, 6 is a weak pitch, and in Tori, 5 is a weak pitch. We can superimpose on that some of the melodic pathways that characterize the musical grammar, the melodic grammar of the two ragas. So in the lower part of the scale, in Tori, you notice that the flat 2 is used in both ascent and descent, whereas in Multani, it is only used very lightly in descent. So to illustrate that in Tori, and in Multani, we'll hear much less of the 2. Similarly, in the upper part of the scale, Tori moves from the sharp 4 to the flat 6 in both directions, usually omitting the intervening 5. Whereas in Multani, 5 is a strong pitch, and one moves from there to the 7, and the flat 6 is taken only in descent. So in Tori, we have whereas in Multani, an important part of the performance of a raga is the alap, an improvised free rhythm exposition in which the notes and phrases of the raga are gradually revealed and developed. It's here that the emphasized pitches and melodic pathways are articulated most clearly, without the need to conform to any metrical framework. The alap may be followed by a second exposition, jor, in which the same melodic process is repeated in a different rhythmic style, with a clearly defined rhythmic pulse. So in alap, one might hear and in jor, same raga, Of course, the underlying melodic conventions are the same for each raga in both alap and jor styles. We wanted to know whether our subjects could internalize these conventions while listening to alap, and then recognize them when listening to jor. For our experiment, we asked the sitarist, Dharimbir Singh, to record an alap and jor, each lasting 5 minutes, in each raga. We divided our subjects into 2 groups and played the alap in raga Tori twice to one group, and that in raga Multani twice to the other group, without telling the subjects the object of our experiment. In the next phase of the experiment, each subject heard short samples from the jor of both ragas in random order, 40 clips from each raga. And we asked them to say whether each clip came from the jor of the raga that they had previously heard. We also asked them to say, for each clip, how confident they were about their answer, on a 6-point scale between completely sure and completely guessing. Given that each participant had previously heard only one of the 2 ragas, for a total of 10 minutes only, and given that the jor examples were stylistically different from the alap that they'd initially heard, I confess that I was doubtful whether our subjects would be able to pick out those clips showing the melodic grammar of the raga with which they had acquired such recent and limited familiarity. The task seemed just too hard. The results, however, were statistically significant. Those who had heard the alap in Multani endorsed the Multani jor samples more frequently than those who had listened to Tori, and vice versa. Musicians scored slightly better than non-musicians. Moreover, we also found a correlation between correct responses and level of confidence. Our subjects were more confident of their answer when giving the right answer. This indicates that they had acquired a degree of judgment knowledge, an awareness of the knowledge they had gained, rather than completely implicit knowledge, in which case they'd have stated that they were guessing. We concluded that our participants, both musicians and non-musicians, had in some measure learned the conventions of an unfamiliar melodic grammar. They did so implicitly, without intending to do so, but they had acquired some judgment knowledge, some awareness of having learned something. They did so rapidly, with only 10 minutes of exposure to one of the 2 ragas. And they did so, this was important to us, they did so on the basis of ecologically valid material, that is, recordings of genuine performances by a master musician, not the synthetic stimuli so often used in music psychology experiments. Our findings indicate that the cognitive ability to learn musical structure from the sound of music alone is not confined to members of the culture concerned, but is available cross-culturally. It is part of what Blacking calls the cognitive equipment to transcend cultural boundaries. This conclusion is not entirely surprising, given that the explicit purpose of alap in Indian music is precisely to make the unique structure and aesthetic character of the raga clear to the listener, to saturate consciousness with the gestalt or image, the swarup, that makes the raga distinct from all other ragas. In the words of the great 13th century theorist Sharangadeva, alap is a manifestation of the raga. We can surmise then that in alap, performers exploit the human capacity for implicit learning, and they do so not by simply repeating notes and phrases, which would be rather boring, but by enlisting another aspect of our human cognitive equipment, the capacity for recursive thought. Like implicit learning, recursion is not confined to the musical domain. It denotes the embedding of one structure inside another, especially within a structure of the same kind. Or, as Pinker and Jackendorf put it, a procedure that calls itself, or a constituent that contains a constituent of the same kind. The picture of a cocoa packet containing a picture of a similar cocoa packet, itself containing another cocoa packet, and so on, illustrates the concept. Recursion is a feature not only of pictures and computer programs, but of normal language. The sentence, "the dog bit the cat," comprises a noun phrase, the dog, followed by a verb phrase, bit the cat. But the verb phrase itself contains another noun phrase, the cat. The sentence is already recursive, and by replicating this structure recursively, we can extend the sentence indefinitely. The dog bit the cat that chased the squirrel that climbed the tree, etc. This is called tail recursion, no reference to the animals concerned. Alternatively, in center embedding, one sentence is embedded in the middle of another instead of at the end. Thus, the cat the dog bit chased the squirrel embeds the sentence "the dog bit the cat" inside the sentence "the cat chased the squirrel." Further embedding becomes hard to understand. In reality, we're unlikely to say "the squirrel, the cat, the dog bit, chased, climbed the tree." But note that we don't have the same difficulty with the cocoa packet. And Stephen Levinson has pointed out that recursion is a feature of communicative interaction that occurs frequently in everyday conversation, where smaller sub-dialogues are regularly nested between a question and its answer. It's been noted that the reason language is recursive is that we have recursive thoughts. In recent years, ambitious claims have been made for the significance of recursion as a human cognitive capacity. Linguists of the Chomsky school attribute the limitless number or discrete infinity of previously unspoken but grammatical sentences to the hierarchical, generative, and recursive organization of the language faculty. And the psychologist Michael Corbalis regards recursion as the primary characteristic that distinguishes the human mind from that of other animals, a capacity that underlies our ability not only to reflect upon our own minds, but also to simulate the minds of others. It allows us to travel mentally in time, inserting consciousness of the past or future into present consciousness. He concludes that recursion has led to the complexities of human civilization, the extinction of the Neanderthals, and our species' supremacy over the physical world, a conclusion shared by Stephen Mithen in his book, The Singing Neanderthals. This may seem a lot to attribute to just one cognitive capacity. But be that as it may, given that recursion has been identified in almost all human languages, it would be surprising if it did not also occur in music. And indeed, it has been identified in Western tonal music. In Schenker's analyses of tonal music, similar procedures can occur at foreground, middle ground, and background. In their generative theory of tonal music, Lerdahl and Jackendorf write that grouping structure is recursive, that is, it can be elaborated indefinitely by the same rules. But the music of the rest of the world remains unexamined from this point of view. Martin Rohrmeyer and I decided, therefore, to investigate whether recursion, like implicit learning, could also be demonstrated in Indian classical music. The obvious place to look was again in alap. In performance, alap is conventionally structured as a gradual ascent of the middle octave from the lower tonic 1 to the octave above, periodically punctuated and finally concluded by returns to the lower 1. In addition, the lower octave may be briefly introduced near the beginning and the higher octave near the end of this process. An alap can be made longer or shorter by the performer, but this overall contour must be retained. I had in fact already argued in an article published in 1981 that the underlying developmental process in alap is what I called then internal scalar expansion. That is, a rising and falling phrase is expanded at successive repetitions by adding higher and higher notes at the apex. The slide shows the underlying model for alap in any raga that I proposed. Each string from A to E results from the recursive application of the same process of internal scalar expansion to the previous string. 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, etc. In real music, this abstract symmetrical model is modified to reflect the scale structure, the pitch hierarchy, and the melodic conventions of the chosen raga. And the performer is free to elaborate each stage in the process of internal scalar expansion by repetition and variation of the string in whole or parts. This process is known to performers as vistar or barhat, both meaning expansion. To explore further how this recursive process underlies alap performance, we analysed the alap in rag Multani that Dharamveer Singh had recorded for our implicit learning experiment, choosing this example because it was conveniently short and recorded for an unrelated purpose. Multani is distinguished by an ascent-descent pitch schema in which scale degrees 1 and 5 are strongly emphasized, while flat 2 and flat 6 are omitted in ascent and only lightly articulated in descent. The raga can be recognized immediately by the key phrase 7-1-3-2-1, 7-1-3-2-1. Our analysis of the alap, which you'll hear in a moment, is designed to highlight the recursion process. This representation is a simplified outline so that the whole alap can be seen at once. In performance, each stage, A, B, and C, and so on, is repeated in whole or parts with variations of emphasis, ornamentation, and so on. And at several points, Dharamveer backtracks to an earlier stage and repeats part of his development, again with variation. This will be made visible as we listen. And of course, at no point does he fast forward prematurely to some later part of the process. At stage A, Dharamveer begins with the key motif of Multani 7-1-3-2-1. This motif informs the connoisseur that the raga is Multani. It's also the source of the recursive process in this performance. After stage A, Dharamveer briefly presents the octave below the starting point. I've omitted this in the analysis as it doesn't form part of the recursive upward expansion. The key motif is then expanded through internal scalar expansion to include pitch 4 in stage B and 5 in stage C. In stage D, having reached pitch 5, the internal scalar expansion process begins again, taking 5 instead of 1 as the starting point. As Dharamveer himself expressed it, 5 becomes a new 1 at this point. And the descending line 5-4-3-2-1 is deferred for the time being. Accordingly, in stage E, the Multani key motif is transposed within the raga scale to end on 5 instead of 1. 4-5-7-6-5 instead of 7-1-3-2-1. This motif is thus recursively embedded within the expansion of itself and becomes the subject of further expansion in the following stages. In stage F, the transposed key motif is expanded to reach upper 1. This pitch now becomes the basis for further expansion, and again the descent from upper 1 back to 5 is deferred. In stage G, the key motif is again transposed, this time up an octave. So it's now doubly embedded within expansions of itself. In stage H, the transposed key motif is itself expanded by internal scalar expansion to reach upper 5, followed by descent to upper 1. Stages G and H are repeated and form the climax of the alap. Stage I is the descent from upper 1 to 5, which was deferred from stage F. And similarly, the descent from 5 to lower 1, deferred from stage D, is completed in stage J. As a coda, Dhornbir then briefly recapitulates the whole sweep of the alap and ends, as he began, with the Multani key motif. Martin and I believe that the structure of this alap demonstrates recursion. According to Lærdal and Jackendorf, recursion is the application of the same set of rules at different levels of structure. Martin suggests that just 2 rules are sufficient to describe the example we've just heard. Prolongation, where a pitch is expanded by repetition of itself, and preparation, where a pitch is expanded by approaching it from another pitch. The tree diagram on the right shows how successive implementation of these 2 rules generates the Multani key motif, 7, 1, 3, 2, 1. By successive expansions of the midpoint, applying prolongation and preparation rules alternately, we can generate the next 2 stages of the alap, reading the outermost leaves of the tree, 7, 1, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, and 7, 1, 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and so on. Martin has proposed that these same 2 rules can also generate the chord sequences of tonal harmony in Western music. So our conclusions are that the structure of alap is intrinsically recursive, that it can accommodate multiple levels of recursion, and that the same 2 rules can be applied recursively to generate the structure of alap. When I discussed these ideas with the performer, Dhorambir Singh, he interpreted the structure of alap in terms of the embedding of the human individual within the cosmos. The concept of successively expanding cosmic realms is traditionally represented in South Asian art in the form of a cosmic diagram, the mandala, in which the universe is represented as a series of concentric areas of circular, square, or triangular geometry populated by gods, goddesses, and other divine beings. This recursive image of the universe can also be imaginatively applied to a region, a town or city, a temple or shrine, or the body of the worshipper himself, whereby the individual sees himself in relation to the cosmos as a whole. Similarly, recursive forms occur extensively in South Asian architecture, literature, and ritual. My colleague at SOAS, Crispin Branfoot, describes structures like this as a form composed of smaller replicas of itself. It seems that recursion is not only a feature of language and music, but is a cross-domain human cognitive capacity, one that's particularly characteristic of South Asian cultural forms, where it tends to be invested with particular spiritual and philosophical meanings and symbolisms. This conclusion suggests that engagement with the workings of musical structure should not preclude consideration of wider cultural perspectives and meanings. Rather, a cognitive perspective may help us to understand the relationships between structure, function, and meaning in music. And so I return to my opening example, Dapha singing in Nepal. After an exceptionally long singing session lasting some 3 hours, I asked the Dattatreya Dapha group whether they felt tired after so much singing. They replied enthusiastically that they did not. When I asked whether they felt happy, they asserted loudly that they did. Unlike the highly professionalized art of Indian classical music, Dapha singing is participatory, open to all, including those of modest musical abilities. It prioritizes the intensity of religious devotion expressed rather than in artistic refinement. Thomas Turino, referring to the work of the psychologist Csikszentmihalyi, argues that participatory music generates for its participants a specific type of psychological experience that he calls flow, and that this is indeed the objective of such musical activities. He writes, "Flow refers to a state of heightened concentration when one is so intent on the activity at hand that all other thoughts, concerns, and distractions disappear and the actor is fully in the present. The experience actually leads to a feeling of timelessness or being out of normal time and to feelings of transcending one's normal self. Regardless of how intense the activity is, people find flow experience restful and liberating because the problems and aspects of ourselves that sometimes get in our way from reaching a clear, open state of mind disappear during intense concentration." While flow can result from many kinds of activity, given the appropriate conditions, music, along with other cultural activities such as religious rituals and games, is seen by Csikszentmihalyi as designed specifically in order to generate flow. Most of these flow-inducing activities involve the collaboration of a number of people. Interaction between them is a major stimulus to the shared experience of flow. This experience, Turino suggests, is particularly associated with participatory musical performance. There are good reasons to think that flow occurs in Dapha. First, Dapha offers many of the conditions in which flow is said to occur. For example, performers show signs of deep concentration and absorption in the present moment, and an altered sense of time in which 2 or 3 hours pass without effort. Secondly, performers describe some of the characteristics of flow experience, such as forgetting the cares and concerns of everyday life. And thirdly, the structure of Dapha performance seems designed to generate flow. This last claim could be illustrated with any item of the Dapha repertoire, but I've selected the song Loka Pancha, one of the shortest, but one of the most important songs in the repertoire of this particular Dapha group. Sung only by this group, the lyrics urge the singers to sing regularly, as indeed they do every day, and pray for protection both to the goddess Natheshwari and to a former patron of the group, King Rajendra Shah of Kathmandu, who established this group with a land grant in 1846. This song is one of the first to be taught to beginners and is sung whenever the group holds a feast. The song comprises 2 verses of 2 lines each. The first line of each verse, line A, is set to a melody called Bod, the second, B, to a melody called Nya. In performance of this song, or any Dapha song, each line of each verse is repeated several times, alternately by the 2 sides of the singing group, according to a standard pattern that the singers have to learn. The 2 sides never sing simultaneously, but they collaboratively construct a continuous musical performance through equal contributions. This alternation of balanced sides of the singing group mirrors the non-hierarchical, cooperative relationship between individuals of equal status that is necessary within a small farming community. Major agricultural tasks must be shared on a reciprocal basis, and a willingness to accept mutual dependence and fulfill mutual obligations is seen both as a moral good and as essential to social and economic survival in this closely knit urban community. Indeed, music is valued in this society precisely because it is seen as leading to the enculturation of its male members into appropriate patterns of reciprocal social and moral behavior. In Dapha, the notion of everyone taking a turn, of making an equal and fair contribution, is enshrined not only in the musical alternation of right and left sides, but also in the allocation of onerous or expensive tasks, for example, organizing a regular feast, on a rota basis. The rotas are strictly enforced, and failure to take one's due turn is punished by fine. In the first verse of Lokapancha, performance begins with 4 repetitions of the A line, the pod, by right and left sides alternately at slow tempo. Each repetition concludes with an instrumental ending pattern, which temporarily disrupts the metrical structure. On the last repetition of A, this closing pattern leads into the B line, nya, which begins at a slow tempo but quickly accelerates to double speed. This speed is then maintained without change through 4 alternate repetitions of B. In the nya, there are no instrumental closing patterns between repetitions. Each group starts singing immediately the other has finished, without gap or pause. Only after the 4th repetition of B do the instruments interrupt the rhythm and tempo with an ending pattern. Thus, the pod and the nya contrast not only in tempo, but in the degree to which the music flows uninterruptedly. This is minimal in the pod, but maximal in the nya. The melody of the 2 sections reflects this change in continuity. In the pod, the melody makes repeated short ascents to the upper 1 and 3, but remains at that level. In the nya, after a final ascent to upper 1, it tumbles in a rapid octave descent. This octave descent is a regular feature of nya melodies. This pattern of antiphonal repetition, ending patterns, and change of tempo is a performance schema that is applied to most Dapha songs. It can be linked, I suggest, with the concept of flow as a psychological experience. In the pod, repeated efforts to establish musical momentum are interrupted by the slow tempo, the instrumental ending patterns which disrupt the metrical continuity, and the repeated ascending movements of the melody. In the nya, rhythmic acceleration and ascending melody at the outset lead to a flow of rhythmic and melodic continuity, fast tempo, repeated octave descent, immediate takeover from side to side, accompanied by fast rhythms on the accompanying instruments. It seems reasonable to assume that an experience of psychological flow is generated in the nya, all the more effectively because of the effortful way in which resistance to flow in the pod has been overcome. Indeed, the Newari noun nya comes from the verb nyaigu, to move on or flow, as of a river, a god chariot, etc. In the case of a heavy object, like a god chariot, nya, or momentum, is only achieved after much repeated pulling and interrupted effort, especially if opposing teams are pulling in opposite directions at the same time. After the pod and nya sections, the A and B lines of verse 1 are again repeated, but in a more complex pattern of alternation called mixed up, tola quola. This section begins with an instrumental interruption and a drop to slow tempo for A, but the fast tempo is quickly resumed and continues to the end of the section without further interruption. At this point, so much momentum has been established that the second verse, which is the last verse in this song, follows without interruption or change of tempo. Its A and B lines are sung to the tola kola pattern at fast tempo throughout, accompanied by rapid instrumental patterns, and ending with an instrumental ending pattern that brings the flow of the song to a halt, like a brake on a speeding vehicle. I said earlier that engagement with the workings of musical structure should not preclude consideration of wider ethnographic perspectives, and that a cognitive approach may help us to understand the relationships between structure, function, and meaning in music. I've illustrated this by showing how the structure and performance of Dapha songs can be linked to both reciprocal social relations within the farmer community and to the generation of flow. Dapha thus illustrates two cognitive capacities that, like the capacity to learn musical structure implicitly and the capacity for recursive thought, can be demonstrated cross-culturally and in both musical and non-musical domains. The connection between musical and social reciprocality is what cultural anthropologists such as Brad Shaw or Maurice Bloch might term a foundational schema or a cultural model, a pattern of thought and behaviour that appears in two or more apparently unrelated cultural domains. Thus, the anthropologist Jerome Lewis has argued that foundational schemas underlie both the polyphonic musical practices of the Pygmies of Central Africa and aspects of their social interaction and hunting techniques essential for survival in the rainforest. The psychological state of flow is claimed to be a universal experience in participatory music making, shared with many other activities, especially activities that involve collaboration by a social group. In Dapha, musical structure seems designed to generate a flow state that would help to account for the endurance, dedication, and enjoyment of the singers. A cognitive ethnomusicology would thus entail reconciling the unique culture-specific meanings revealed by ethnography with cognitive capacities that are limited neither to specific cultures nor to the musical domain, but which may underlie thought, feeling, and experience universally. This I take to be what John Blacking meant by the cognitive equipment that we have in our bodies to transcend cultural boundaries and resonate at the common level of humanity. Thank you very much.